Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unsubscribe, the Demand Drive podcast. It is I, your host, AJ Alonso, and today we've got 5 questions for Clement Schneider. Before we go ahead and turn it over to him, though, got to turn it over to my co-host, Alex, see how he's doing. Alex, how are you today?
It's a good day. I'd give it an 8 out of 10 so far.
Wow, that's actually pretty good.
So far. There's time for it to go down. You know, we start at the
enough.
8. We'll see.
I don't like that method, starting at the top and working your way down. I want my day to get better as I go on, but hey, to each their own, I guess. With myself and Alex today, like I mentioned, we have Clement Schneider. Clement, I'll turn it over to you, give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the audience, a bit of background about who you are, and then we can dive on in.
Sure. Thanks, Alonso. Hey, Alonso, Alex. Nice to be here today. So I'm Clement. I'm based in Switzerland. I work mainly at startup all day long. I've experienced startup from the US, startup from Switzerland, startup from China, working at marketing mainly, a bit of sales. I was director of sales at Lingolet, US-based startup, and right now I'm in a marketing position at SalesWings in Switzerland.
Awesome. So you've kind of done it all in the startup world, right? You've seen the sales side, you've seen the marketing side. It's those marrying those two things together to really get something off the ground. That's where your experience lies, and that's what we want to focus on mostly today. Is looking at sort of that startup and specifically that entrepreneurial pathway that a lot of people can take. I know when you think about the startup world, there's a lot of connotations that come along with it in terms of like getting your hands dirty and putting it into all the buckets and doing everything. But let's talk about your experience as someone who's been in the startup world for a while, what it's like working in that capacity. And then we can turn the lens over to what it looks like for SDRs to kind of focus in on that area as well.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is that you need to grow. You need to grow fast. You need to find the best way to grow, and sometimes you just don't have people to help you grow. So you need to help the startup grow with your skills, with your learning, your new skills, and every day you need to learn something new and to achieve something new. So that's pain in the ass, but that's also what's great about startup. You know, I think you guys, you are not 15 at doing marketing at Demand Drive. I don't have a 20-person marketing department right now at SalesWings. So, you know, you need to figure it out. So this is what it is, working at a startup. You travel from job to job every day, every night, sometimes doing what you can to help the business grow.
Yeah, and it definitely is, and I wouldn't say unconventional, but sort of that traditional, you show up to the office 9 to 5, you do your job, is a mindset that you just like can't have as a startup, right? There's nothing to maintain because you're trying to build that up. You're trying to grow that, like you just mentioned. So turning that lens, they just sort of pointed to it, turning that lens towards SDRs and what their role is specifically within the startup. I'd love to get your take. Obviously, people have their hands in all sorts of buckets, right? You've got small, agile teams. What types of things do you normally see SDRs doing, especially that they're doing that they might not do at another larger company that are really working to help the startup grow?
So formally, I would say, you know, SDR, sometimes we say they welcome new leads. Sometimes they do outreach. I would say in an early stage startup, you need to go out for the leads. So the SDR typically would do more outreach than taking care of the inbound leads. This is one thing, but then the other thing is the discovery phase. You need to, you don't come as an SDR in a startup with a red carpet and all the process already shaped. You know, you need to find out what the process will be. And this is what's very particular, I think, because you need to know how you will talk to customer, what they want to hear, who are the customers. Do you need to pivot because you learn something new about your ICP? So this is really, I would say, the discovery mode is really important when you work as an SDR in a startup.
It's it's interesting at how you would parallel that with someone who works at a maybe a larger organization where your role is a little bit more defined, I would say, and maybe to your point where like if your organization is a bit more maturing, you have the opportunity to split SDRs and like inbound and outbound and all that stuff. Like if I'm an SDR working at an enterprise level organization, discovery obviously very important, but it doesn't hold the same weight as it does for a company that doesn't 100% know like what their go-to-market strategy really looks like because they're learning it as they build. What the phrase is like building the plane as they're flying is what I hear a lot when it comes to startups in terms of like, yeah, we can learn one thing in a week and then all of a sudden all of our messaging has to change because it's something we didn't foresee or like the market dictates that we should go this direction. So it's interesting that SDRs have so much weight and responsibility associated with them in a startup level versus at like an enterprise level organization or even a small business that has it kind of figured out at that point.
Yeah, and I would add that they may also need to discover the tools because when you come in a startup, the CEO doesn't really know what are the SDR tools that they want to use, and they don't know the tools. So the discovery mode goes all the way to the tools the SDR want to use.
Very true. Yeah, it's like we'll touch on this in a little bit in terms of like who runs startups because I think that's the direction the conversation should be going. But like it's not always salespeople, right? It's sometimes it's engineers or just like leaders in general. They're not plugged into the world of okay, like what's the best tech stack for my SDR? How do I get them to be as efficient as possible? Like it's up to the reps themselves to figure that out and really build out a system and process that works for them while also being an SDR. So it's almost like you're both an SDR and some semblance of an SDR manager at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's I don't know. I would consider it a pro personally as like a check mark for being an SDR at a startup is you get that experience and you get to learn and grow within the role. Obviously, some people might consider that a con in that like you aren't necessarily given everything that you should be given to succeed. Are there any other like pros or cons that you can think of when it comes to comparing the two of being an SDR in that startup world versus what it's like working for a more established organization?
You need to be an entrepreneur. You need to be passionate about what you are doing more than ever. Because if you don't have this process in place, you may tap into the water. So you need to be even more conciliant and really stay on the job every day and be resilient to rejection even more than usual because it's really a hard job. But the pro is that then the reward is very big. Because if you can find the good way to promote your company as an SDR for the first time, then you are very, very happy, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's key there is if you join as an SDR at a startup like that, you have a lot more sway within the business. We already sort of talked about this, but you have beyond just what you can do as an SDR, that ability to grow is probably, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times easier at a startup. If you're, say you're successful in both situations, there's a much easier and more interesting, at least in my opinion, growth path for your career when you're just an SDR at a startup versus an SDR who like joins a large enterprise organization and you're one of 50 SDRs. And it's like, wow, I'm competing with all these people just to become my manager. And then what happens from there versus this sort of SDR growth? Have you seen any interesting or remarkable career paths come out of an SDR you may have worked with at any one of these startups?
Not really. But my personal experience showed me that everything is possible, you know. I didn't know a thing about sales when I studied at Lingolet, and then boom, director of sales, you know, because I studied at marketing. It was very plain organization, no verticality at all. I proved my value, and 2 years later I was like, okay, do you want to take over sales? I say, all right, let's do it, you know, but you need to train me. Yeah, don't worry, we'll pay someone to train you. And that never happens, you know, so I learned by myself. So, you know, it's the same for an SDR, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very much like a go-getter type situation, right? We've talked about this on different podcasts and through some of our content, but like there's a mentality that you have to have as an SDR, that growth mindset to really, if you want to grow up and out of the role in some capacity, most of the onus needs to be put on you as a rep. Like you need to go out and find what systems work for you, what processes can I build, what tools can I use, how can I be as successful as possible with what's given to me. And that's highlighted in the world of startups where almost nothing is given to you versus working at like a brand name company where, you know, if you call somebody and you say, hey, you know, this is AJ from Gong, for example. Like Gong's a household name at this point in the sales world. They know who I am, they know what I'm calling about. But if instead it's some startup that no one's ever heard of, you have to work so much harder to make sure that you capture somebody's attention and really like get them into your sales funnel. So there's obviously that difference. And the SDRs who want to do that go out and they do it and they succeed. And then there are SDRs who kind of not can't, but maybe that's not the path for them and they don't want to have to work at that capacity and they'd rather kind of move up the track at a larger organization. It's not for everybody. So
because you can't count on a great website, you can't count on great case study, you can't count on the marketing department because it's so already overwhelmed, you know. So of course you need to make up everything for yourself.
Yeah, and being able to do all that by yourself, right, is a huge skill. You're talking a little bit about aligning the marketing and the SDRs, and we talk all the time, AJ, on this podcast and other areas about how important that connection is between sales and marketing, making sure that communication is as seamless as possible. In your opinion, Clement, how do you see the SDR and the SDR function sort of helping be a bridge between those two departments, especially in a startup environment?
So it's really about getting to know your ideal customer. You know, when you launch a product or service, the best way to prove it's working, it's just to go out there, ask question, interview. And this is what an SDR do. Talk to the customer as soon as he can and go out there. And he has kind of this mindset that marketers maybe don't have. So this really helps when you need to understand what product to build, what are the features you want to highlight, the values you want to highlight, how should you build your wording, website, etc. You guys are the front line as SDR. So this is really interesting for marketing.
We touched on it, like Alex mentioned, in literally, I think the most recent episode of this podcast, where maybe it's 2 episodes ago at this point, but it's that feedback loop that you can create between the SDR team and then, I mean, in this case specifically marketing, in making sure that your company can remain agile and that they can pivot if need be, is using all of the information that these frontline reps are getting to influence marketing content, to influence messaging, to influence your ICP. I think at larger organizations, it's often not as necessary because they have a more structured and well built out idea of who are we targeting and why. But you're right, in the startup world, you don't 100% know right away. So you have to test and sort of use the SDRs as that frontline sort of resource for you to figure it out and like hear from the horse's mouth, as they say. What do you care about? Am I right? Am I wrong? It's almost like you're testing assumptions by sending SDRs out there and having them figure out what do people care about.
Yeah, and they can also understand why those leads reached out to you. So maybe this lead isn't qualified. Why did this lead fill out a form? You know, if she's not our ideal customer, why is she now talking to me? And I should give this feedback to marketing departments. So maybe they need to tweak a bit the website, tweak a bit the value proposition, things like that.
Yeah. It really. Go ahead, Alex. I was just gonna agree.
I mean, I also agree. But
thank you, guys.
But I do think it's interesting because you say that, and at a startup, I think this is one of the things that, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, Clement, but at a startup, it's much easier to create that communication and create that feedback loop. Whereas if you're at a large enterprise organization, there's a lot of bureaucracy you have to go through, a lot of layers of management. just to get your own feedback, like, hey, was that a good lead that I passed to you, Mr. Account Executive or Mrs. Account Executive? And at a startup, it's a lot easier to shoot a Slack to probably the one salesperson that you've become, like, have a good connection with, and you've built that relationship with. And I just think that's an interesting thing to point out, because earlier we were talking about there's a lot of things that are harder about working at a startup. You're probably working later nights, you're more absorbed in the work, you're more passionate about it, but it's a lot easier to grow because you're starting in such a small place, and building those connections and building those relationships, I think is a crucial part of that can sort of be overlooked when you're more focused on the numbers and on just like growth of the company versus growth of the relationships that are happening within it.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. And like, yeah, the pros and cons, obviously you can kind of go on and on about it, but like, yeah, I think when people look at, because alignment is such a hot button topic, and people talk about how difficult it is, how difficult it can be to get sales and marketing to work together. But like, if you do look at a startup, smaller organization, maybe there's just one person who heads up sales and one person who heads up marketing, they usually get along just fine. And it's because they're aligned to the same thing. Like, they're both focused on growing the company, on building revenue. And at the base level, that's what all revenue generating departments care about, revenue. And if you take that idea and you transpose it into a larger organization, it can be that basic. It can be like, look, you guys care about the same thing. You have the same team reporting to you in the SDRs. They're helping drive revenue. You're both responsible for managing them in some capacity. Get along. You know, don't slap them on the wrist or whatever, but like, it should be that easy. Most of the time it just isn't.
Yeah, it should.
But SDRs can really help out with that in terms of kind of bridging that gap between the two, for sure.
Yeah, totally. I think the role of marketing, especially in the B2B space, is to translate salespeople mind or thoughts into marketing actions, you know? This is really hard to do, but it should work. Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Like, I can imagine an SDR having conversations and they take notes and stuff and they pass it off to marketing, and then it's like this magical thing that happens where all of a sudden that those notes get passed back into relevant messaging or content. And it's like, wow, how'd that happen? Like, that's not magic. It's just marketing doing their job, listening to what our audience is saying and spitting back out what they want to hear.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of that, and the idea that SDRs can work closely with marketing, and obviously they work closely with sales development rep, it's in the title. More often than not, the role is looked at as sort of a stepping stone into that full cycle sales rep, that account executive level role. But in startup world, you see SDRs take on a bunch of different responsibilities that can then translate into a bunch of different career pathways. I was an SDR. I'm in marketing. Alex is the same way. But I mean, we've all seen SDRs go into customer success, into revenue operations, into leadership. The list can go on and on. But I think an interesting thing I want to touch on is that idea that the well-rounded SDR at a startup who gets exposed to all this stuff can then turn into this entrepreneur and think about starting their own company because of it. Is that something that you've seen happen, or is it something you want to see more of, like the SDR kind of leveraging their experience into building their own company?
So what I can say for sure is that if you don't have this SDR mentality, this entrepreneurial mindset that is needed as an SDR, you will struggle being a solo entrepreneur because if you start from scratch and you don't know how to go out there and understand your market and talk to your future customer and to your leads and to your prospect and start closing them, it will be very hard to get your first clients, or you will need to hire an SDR, but that's already a big spend for you. And you need to find someone who is willing to sacrifice money, to work for free, and to start to build the business with you. So I would say this is kind of a required skills to have to start a company, this SDR mentality.
It's something that it's almost too easy to think that way, right? Like, of course it makes sense that if you're an SDR, you have this, and we'll qualify it. If you're a good SDR and you actually have the right mindset to grow within the role, growing up and out of the role into running your own business makes sense, because a lot of those, like you said, are they parallel one another. But it's not something we see all that often. We don't see a lot of SDRs kind of take that entrepreneurial pathway. They're often kind of blocked into going further down the funnel and working in that AE level role. Do you think that maybe organizations force that for because they want to hold on to talent, or like it's just not something that's talked about enough? I just don't see it all that often. So, and I want to see it more often.
Good question. I think you need to rephrase this.
I guess like more often than not, SDRs get pushed into that AE role at organizations because that's just natural, right? It's like a natural stepping stone. Is it natural because companies just think it works and it's the easiest thing for them to do, or because we don't see them offer up enough opportunities to do other things with the skills that SDRs have built?
I would say it depends of the nature of the company again, because if you work at a startup, it's not about big department. It's not about being a sales or marketing person or the CEO of anything. When you grow into such big companies, big departments, of course, you don't have the training to learn marketing on your own, or just to learn marketing from scratch, or maybe you don't have any history of marketing. So of course you don't know how to use the tools yet. All the processes are in place. So you cannot start switching jobs like this. But if you work at a startup, then of course, if you want to take 1 month off to learn marketing and bring some value 1 month later, you can. If you want to learn new skills and it brings value to the company, you can. So later on, if you want to start your own company, you can also, because you had time to learn all of these new skills. So this is, I don't think this is something that we do to keep those salespersons in place and in the sales department. I think it's really something that depends on the process and what's required for the job.
Yeah, and I also wonder how much of it has to do with the SDR role being an early job out of college or lower on the totem pole, even within startups, and the fact that when you enter an SDR role, you're typically given more guidance than probably a lot of the other positions within a startup, and definitely other positions within a larger company. And I wonder how much of that has to do with, like, so I'm comfortable being trained, but am I comfortable training myself? And I wonder how much that is sort of a big difference there, that you might pick up better at a startup, how to train yourself, right? Like you were just mentioning. But there's definitely something about like stepping out on your own that I think might be missing from that SDR taking that step to become an entrepreneur, to step away from a steady income and say like, no, you know what, I'm going to step out on my own. I'm going to do this myself or with a small group of people and really try something. There's that level of risk that I just wonder if every SDR is comfortable with or not.
Yeah, it's like a self-sufficiency thing, right? Like some people just are and naturally can sort of fend for themselves and like figure out how to, like you were mentioning, Clement, like build up skills around marketing that you might not have and like learn how to do that. And some people are just better at like fitting in and doing the work that's presented to them, doing it really well, and then doing the next thing, and then doing the work that's presented to them, doing it well, and doing the next thing. So I think you're right. Like there's a mentality associated with it, but it's also like there are how you phrase and how you build the SDR position also impacts it greatly, because at startups, you have to be self-sufficient, right? You have to have that mindset to grow. And at larger organizations, maybe that's not instilled in you early on. So you might not have that, that bug or that itch to try and go build something on your own.
Yeah, and you may need a big degree, big experience to take some responsibilities and ownership of some project. Whereas in a startup, you can just take whatever you want if you can bring value.
Take whatever you want. I like that. That's
Yeah.
that's a great thing to pull from this episode. If you're going to learn anything, if you're in a startup, do whatever you want. It's fine.
You don't get any money from it, so you know you can do it. Have fun.
No, this has been fun. Clement, I don't know if there's any big wisdom or advice that you would want to impart on anyone who's listening to this that thinks maybe I do want to, if I'm working at a startup and I've built up a bunch of these skills and I'm a well-rounded SDR, how I can leverage this into starting something on my own or building something. Any big piece of advice that you would give to that listener who's thinking about going down that path?
I think it's very straightforward. There are so much materials online to learn new skills. Learning marketing isn't difficult. Learning sales isn't that difficult. Learning how to manage people isn't that difficult. So if you take some time when you can to learn new skills and then to experiment within your own company those new skills, then you may be ready to start a new path, or maybe to start a new position like you did, AJ. Everything comes down to learning and willing to want to learn something new. Sorry.
Oh, that's great. I think that's really good advice to anyone, because so you can go out on a limb and you can figure it out on your own, but if you have the luxury of working at an organization where you can test some stuff out before jumping out and doing that, you have to take it, because how else are you gonna, it's trial by fire at that point, and that's not fun. I would say sink or swim is not really a good mentality to have about that. But I think that's a great piece of advice.
I think it's so easy to go to the marketing department and just ask them, hey guys, what's your funnel looking like right now? Or why do you build your website like this? Or can you show me Google Analytics? What's your strategy for the 5 next years? And then go to your CEO, or maybe the advisor of the CEO or the board, or I don't know, an investor or anything, finding a mentor that can help you grow in different job types.
Yeah, that proactivity, I think, really also speaks well to that SDR mindset in general. Like, if you're a good SDR and you want to grow, you have to be proactive about it. And I think people will be receptive to it. I know if an SDR comes up to me and they ask me the same questions that you just mentioned, like, what are our goals for the next 5 years? Can you show me a Google Analytics dashboard? I'm dropping whatever I'm doing to help this person out, because it tells me that they're hungry and they want to grow. And that's an asset to my organization in the long term versus just, another SDR who's doing the job well.
You see someone you want to promote to a manager position, no?
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Clement, this has been great. Thanks so much for hopping on and chatting with us. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more about SalesWings and what you guys are doing, how can they find you?
You can go to our LinkedIn page, I guess. Type in SalesWings on LinkedIn, and you will learn how we leverage customer journey tracking to align sales and marketing department together.
All about alignment. Awesome. Thanks again for hopping on, Clement. Really appreciate it. Remember to subscribe, to unsubscribe, get more episodes like this, learn how to build up those SDR skills, and we'll see you next time.